Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to another Indie Game Friday, where each week I take a look at a different independent role-playing game. This time I'm delving into a bit of a budget title, Scavenger. Developed and published by Vidama Software LLC, it was released on Steam back on August 21st, 2019. Scavenger is what appears to be a relatively low-budget dungeon-crawling focused title with a unique presentation that takes a little bit of getting used to, but is, in my opinion, a pretty interesting departure from the usual genre tropes. In terms of plot, Scavenger centers around a town that has long profited from being perched right at the brink of a dungeon of unknown origin that resets itself every night. When your character arrives, the city has mysterious figures floating in the sky above it and is otherwise largely abandoned. The lord of the town has decided to seal the dungeon as it has grown more dangerous, but the people he sent down to do so have not returned, and thus your character is drafted to begin to secure the dungeon and find out what happened. When you first start the game, you can select between difficulty levels whose effects are clearly outlined in the tooltips, as well as decide whether to play an Iron Man game. You then select a class. Each class has a series of available equipment that they can use, a set of starting spells and enhancements, a number of starting hit points, and then starting equipment. You may then rename your character before beginning the game. Once you start the game, you're treated to a minor dialogue screen that starts the main quest, and then you're dropped directly into town. The town itself consists of a simple menu screen with several options. There is a town level, which is improved by completing the main quest line. The Lord option lets you speak with the Lord of the town and advance the main quest. There's an item shop that allows you to purchase and sell utility items, and an equipment shop that lets you purchase and sell equipable gear. The town also has a zoo that you can store charmed pets in, an inn where you can rest or regain side quests, a bank where you can bank golden items to share between characters. The alley lets you spend gold on randomized items and equipment. The seeker lets you spend money to find quest objectives and to enchant gear with random enchantments. And the academy lets you spend experience to make potions of skill. Finally, the dungeon puts you into the dungeon. There are two general interface elements that are shared between this and other screens as well. One is the player status bars, which display health, stamina, and experience. There's also a series of icons to manage the character in the upper right. The first icon allows you to review equipment and characters' internal stats. Each character can equip 7 items, 1 in each hand, some armor, a helm, a necklace, a cloak, and some boots. Characters have 4 intermediate stats that can be reviewed here as well. Physical damage, melee damage, physical defense, and magical defense. The next icon lets you review consumable items. There is a limit on how much of each consumable item you can take on any particular run, which provides an overall limit of how far you can explore each time. The next tab is your spell list. Now, spells can be cast in or out of combat each time with a different effect. For instance, casting acid in combat causes acid damage and then ongoing acid damage, while casting it out of combat raises your defense instead. The next icon is the stats and skill tree. Here, under stats, you can see more detailed stats, damage, and resistance for the many different categories of damage in the game: physical, fire, lightning, water, stone, acid, mental, holy, and shadow. Skills is the skill tree, where you may raise different skills as you level up. Each skill gives you a percentage chance to activate an ability in combat each round, and you can increase them with points that you receive after each level. Skills include critical hit, critical cast, double cast, balance that offers an attack and defense at the same time, dual strike that allows you to cast and attack at the same time, defend, which dramatically increases your defense, evasion, which increases your defense and lasts a few rounds, and then finally traps that improves your ability to run away freely. There's also a class diagram that shows when special bonuses are unlocked at each level, arranged around a course that you just follow automatically. The next icon offers the information tabs. One on the right-hand side you can review your active quests on, which are simply what to find, kill, accomplish, etc., and what level you can expect to find them on. You can also see the number of creatures that you've killed of each type, at least up to a certain number needed to gain more information about them. The final icon simply returns you to the main menu. When you enter the dungeon, at first you simply go to the first level, but as you reach lower levels you can enable a teleport directly down to them for some gold. When the overall limit on resting in exploration is considered, this can actually be a necessary step to reach lower levels. The dungeon exploration is simplistic in the extreme. Rather than any first-person view of the dungeon or tile-based material, you're presented simply with a grid of rooms. At first only a few are visible, but others may be shown over time. Each room shows what connections it has to other rooms, whether they are open or walled, and displays an icon showing its contents. Icons representing general monster encounters or bosses, chests to loot, stairs up or down, and question marks to represent miscellaneous encounters. Rooms without an icon are simply empty and you can pass through them. Moving from room to room takes an amount of stamina for each step, so retracing your steps, even through empty rooms, can eat into your ability to explore overall. When you are no longer having any stamina, you can still move from room to room, but it costs health instead. At any time, you may rest as long as you have rations in your inventory. Due to the limit of the number of rations that you can actually purchase on each run, this sets an overall cap on how far you can effectively go each time. Aside from restoring your stamina, resting also restores health. You can also use other consumables to restore stamina or health without resting, or to give special bonuses for a short time. When you enter a square with a chest, you are simply given an option to open it or use a key. All chests are automatically trapped, and you are given the amount of damage that you will take before defenses are accounted for, the percentage chance to avoid the damage if you just open it, and then the option to use one of your limited number of keys. Using a key opens a chest automatically, which will generally contain some sort of loot. Special encounters generally open up dialogue screens. These may be simple one-entry options to complete the current quest, but more often involve some sort of challenge or optional kind of selection. You are given up to 3 options on how to handle each encounter based on your skills, equipment, and the nature of the encounter. Some of these options may be unavailable if you lack the particular skill or item in question. For instance, if a particular outcome requires you to have medium armor and you don't have it, you simply cannot select it. Encounters can be wildly different and may provide 3 rewards, 3 hazards, or some mix thereof. The results of each option are clearly stated, so you can pick whichever suits you best at that particular moment, and you don't have to worry too much about them. Finally, there are creature encounters. These open up the combat screen and come in 2 flavors: monster encounters and boss encounters. I'm going to cover them both as one because boss encounters are simply creatures from a level or so deeper in the dungeon, and as such aren't really too overwhelming. Combat is one of the more interesting adaptations of the game. Each combat faces you off against one creature. You generally always attack first, and then turns alternate until you win or lose. During combat, the character's status bar remains visible, and beneath that you may see certain icons representing your temporary buffs and debuffs, as well as any pets that you may have. On the right-hand side, you get the creature information with the name of the creature and its health bar. If you have information on the enemy in question, you can also access their resistances through the information icon. Beside their status bar is their next intended action. You are given the type of attack or action to expect and how much damage it will likely do. This can help you decide which actions to take. On the lower right-hand side of the screen are your available action options. There's generally 6 options represented by different icons. The base options are cast a buff or debuff, use an item, guard to avoid some damage and some debuffs, run from combat, cast an offensive spell, or attack. If one of the skills that you have invested in triggers, this may change the option available and thus the icon it is associated with. Some of the skills may link 2 options, which means that if you use either one, both will go off. Generally speaking, the results of your actions are easily predictable, including the damage that they do. Only a few have random chances that are not determined before you execute them. Once you've won a combat, you get a bit of loot and experience, and that square remains clear until the next time you leave and re-enter the dungeon. Each time you enter, the dungeon room contents are randomized, but the connections and stairs remain the same, so you can eventually get a pretty good route through the level without having to worry too much. And so the game goes. You grab random quests to complete for gold, spend gold for gear and other randomized rewards, enter the dungeon, return back to town, and just rinse and repeat. The primitive representation of the game does it no favors, but it does make for a break from the usual first-person explorations. However, the way that the map exploration is handled kind of mixes in with the best parts of the way that combat and alternative encounters are handled. See, with most everything that usually be randomized determined at the start of a round, and all of the locations of enemy icons and treasure determined before you even step onto a tile, and all the rewards and penalties for encounters options visible from the get-go, The game tends to take on a far more strategic element with its simplistic presentation, and you can actually determine what you want to risk versus what your possible reward is with some fair amount of consistency. You can view your resources and decide whether or not you really want to take on that next combat. Once in combat, you can know what your next spell is going to do in terms of extra damage or whether your attack will go off twice, and you can compare that with the risk involved with knowing what the monster plans to do. You might find situations where even though things are all bonus on your side, you've got crits, you've got double attacks, you may still want to defend just because that monster is preparing a massive attack that will leave you with a massive debuff. Little touches like that make the combat a little bit more thoughtful than I had at first expected. The fact that gold and items can be shared across characters, and in some cases pets can as well, means that even though each character is considered a separate playthrough for purposes of main quest lines, the overall town itself serves as a hub. It's like having a bunch of parallel playthroughs going on all at once, but then they can share resources with one another. Overall, it makes for a surprisingly fun little game loop that is well worth the price of admission, and on that alone I would recommend the game. And it's probably good that I do recommend the game on that, because as for graphics and sound, well, Dungeon Scavenger does have the occasional 3D art, especially when facing monsters, and it does have some very decent flat illustrations here and there when dealing with special encounters and in background information and when dealing with the initial classes. I almost wish that they'd stuck with the same illustration style with the monsters, since those illustrations are pretty typical fantasy fare, while the 3D renderings of the monsters are in a sort of cartoonish lo-fi style, and it makes for a really clashing sort of vision. Interface is basic text and icons on bland scroll work, pretty much what you'd expect of a next-to-no budget game. There are viable, easily referenced, and understandable elements to this, but they don't really stand out. The music is actually pretty good, although I'm not sure if it's just a selection from a library or custom from the game itself, and the credits screen was kind of unenlightening in that regard. Regardless, the tracks fit in well, and it's one of the more appropriate and consistent parts of the entire experience. All in all, Dungeon Scavenger is a fun little diversion that has some surprising amount of strategic depth, despite how simplistic the presentation is overall. The combat and exploration systems are certainly different from what I'd expected, and that's not a bad thing, just a decent break from the usual ideas. I feel like I'd probably be less inclined to give this game the benefit of the doubt if it was a more expensive title, but the price point is about right for what I'd expected going into it. If you can find it on sale, then so much the better. And on that note, I'm going to leave it off here. As always, I'll put a link to where you can pick it up in the description below. For now, this has been the RPG Crawler with Indie Game Friday Dungeon Scavenger. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. Until next time, take care and goodbye. And if you're still watching this far, I'd like to take a moment to thank those who have supported this channel via Patreon or direct donations throughout the years, without which this channel could not have lasted as long as it has. For those who are feeling particularly generous, you can still support my work through Patreon and now through Subscribestar as well, through the links in the description below.